Hola amigos, bien o no, y saludos desde Medellín. Um, entonces, el tema de hoy es complejidad de, de palabras o de lengua que nosotros utilizar y cuando es apto para utilizar palabras muy complicadas o muy avanzadas y cuando no. Ese es el tema de hoy. So, hello again from Medellin. Here we are. Well, you might see behind me we have another storm on the way. One's just finished, so we might have to make this a quick video. But the idea today came out of a conversation with one of my students earlier this week. What type of language do we need to use in particular circumstances? Is it always necessary to use, let's say, complicated words or phrases? Is that always appropriate? Now, in some cases, we need to demonstrate that we can use correctly more complicated phrases to show that we have a higher level of capability in the language. While we have a better level of fluency, we're doing better in it. But be careful. Be careful. Because unless you're using a word that is like a very technical vocabulary, and that's the only way you can describe the thing you're doing, because the subject you're talking about is a very technical subject, something like medicine or science or computing or mathematics, something like that, often it is better to try and find a slightly simpler way of explaining what you want to talk about. Because if you start using a lot of complicated words because you understand them, it doesn't mean always that the other person you're talking to will. And there is a difference between understanding words you see written down in books, particularly textbooks, because you need to understand what the author's talking about when he's writing it, and the kind of words we would use just to explain that idea to other people. And this gets more complicated the more academically we study. So if your studying is taking you in that direction because you want to read more complicated books on the subject that interests you, and you're noticing that there's a lot more vocabulary to learn every time you're doing the reading, this is not a bad thing. This is a good thing, because there's an awful lot of words in English, and the more of them you understand, the better. But remember, there is a big difference between written English, and particularly written English in, let's say, textbooks, particularly books for like university type study. There's a big difference for that type of language, which can be very specialist, can be very technical, can be the type of language where the person writing the book already expects you to know a lot of things about his subject. So it's not a book for beginners in that sense. If you start using a lot of those phrases or odd words that you picked up and you don't use them in exactly the same context, like in a book or when you're talking to people that are also expert on the topic, you might end up causing confusion, or you might need to have to explain in simpler words that technical term you're using. So it's a difficult balance to strike, but it's worth thinking about depending on the type of conversations you know you've got coming up. So let's give a direct example to make this easy to see. Let's say you're going to have an interview, and obviously part of that interview they're going to talk to you about or ask you questions about your expertise, your specialism in the job that's your profession, the one you have all the experience in. explaining some parts of that job, you will need to use probably some type of technical language to describe it, which is okay because that's the job you're going for, and therefore you're going to need to use some of the technical language to explain those points. But as well as that, they might ask you more general questions, the kind of questions that all interviewees, all candidates at job interviews get asked regardless of their type of job they're going for. Questions like, can you give me an example of how you deal with stress? Or, when was the last time you worked in a team? What type of responsibility did you have? Do you consider yourself a good communicator? These type of questions, you don't necessarily need to use very complicated language to answer. In fact, if you think carefully about those type of questions, you can probably come up with a much clearer answer with simpler words that's easier to say, easier to remember, and then you're going to sound more confident and the other person will understand you better. So that's something to think about. Complicated language is not always appropriate. Have a think about that. That's our topic for the day. So on that happy note, I am going to leave my terrace because, as you may note, oh, you may have seen behind me, the rain's coming back. So from Medellin, it's Cheerio. I'll see you tomorrow.